It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to share these 2 hours with you. Special welcome to all the people who have joined us. I will be speaking mostly freely. I've decided basically to have 2 parts. In the first part, I will give a short overview of Heidegger's life and share some photos of Heidegger with you that you may not have seen before, so you get a little bit of an impression of what kind of person Heidegger was. And then in the second part, I will try to retrace the most important steps of his decades-long path of thinking. And there will come across the problems, also the possibilities for the future of Heidegger thinking. You can feel free to ask questions while I'm speaking. You don't have to wait until the end. If you have some point you would like me to clarify or talk a little bit more about, then feel free to do so either by raising this little yellow hand that you can, or just speak out. So I'll show you first a little paper that I prepared with some of the things you may know. Of course, Martin Heidegger was born on September 26, 1889, in a small town in southwest Germany called Messkirch. This means that Heidegger was born when there was still an empire. There was still an emperor in Germany. And since he died in 1976, during Heidegger's lifetime, let's say the whole development of modern technology took place. When he was born, there were hardly any cars. It was the beginning of radio. There was no television. Of course, there was no internet. There were no computers. And he lived through the 2 world wars as well. These are determining experiences also for Heidegger's thinking. Heidegger is somebody who starts thinking from his own life, the facticity of his own life, in being in time that's named thrownness, Geworfenheit. And that means that Heidegger can only disclose the world and being from his own existence. And that means that he stands in a tradition of German philosophy that goes back to the Greek origin of philosophy. And he's also living according to the possibilities of his time. As a young boy, he went to the so-called Bürgerschule in Messkirch, which is the first school that the kids went to in those years. Here, he already was an outstanding pupil, so the priest of Messkirch noticed that Heidegger was a very intelligent young man. He comes from a simple family. His father was a sexton of the St. Martin's Church in Messkirch, and also a cooper maker. He made barrels for wine and other liquids to keep them safe and protected. You can find a trace of this experience of Heidegger as a young boy visiting his father in his workshop, making these barrels in Being and Time, where he talks about the workplace, where all the equipment has its own place and is all relating to each other. The nails to the hammer, and the hammer to the job to be done, making a table, for example. And this priest decided to give Heidegger private lessons in Latin. And there are 2 reasons. One reason is that young boys like Heidegger from a relatively poor family were often picked up by the Catholic Church and selected to become priests. So the church would more or less finance their education, finance their studies, and in this way have new priests. The other reason is that if you wanted to go to university in Germany at the time, you had to visit first the gymnasium, and you could only get into the gymnasium if you had some knowledge of Latin. So that's why it was necessary to teach Heidegger the basics of the Latin language. Messkirch was a small town. It had about 5,000 inhabitants. So it was also a place where everybody knows everybody. And Heidegger grew up with his friends and he kept these friendships alive during his whole life. When he would go back to Messkirch much later in the 60s, for example, he would get together with his old classmates in a bar or a restaurant in Messkirch. Since the nearest gymnasium was in Constance, on Lake Constance, a pretty beautiful city. And of course, for Heidegger, when he went there, it was a broadening of his horizon. From the small town Messkirch, he came into a much bigger city, and there he stayed at the Conradi house, which is a seminary for young boys that went to the gymnasium. So it's like a boarding school basically, that with a very strong Catholic element in it. They would do daily prayers, do spiritual exercises and things like that. Interestingly enough, Heidegger does land it into different worlds. On the one hand, he was living almost like a young monk in this seminary, and at the same time, the gymnasium that he went to was a public school and basically a liberal and modern school, not a Catholic school. So his classmates were basically the boys of the upper classes in Constance. One of his best friends, Bruno Leiner, was the son of uh, the chemist, now the pharmacy owner in Constance. And this friend Bruno Leiner, where he lived at home, there were servants still. So they had a cook and maids that were living and serving the family. So for Heidegger, it was a contrast between this modern, open society and the more close Catholic atmosphere that he grew up in the seminary. In 1906, he moved to gymnasium in Freiburg. And there he had a similar life. Freiburg, of course, is a city with a university, and it's also quite a few times bigger than Constance, and close to the French border. So it was another broadening of his horizon. And as planned, he was supposed to go to become a priest after finishing his high school studies. So on September 30, 1909, he went to the College of the Jesuits in Thesis. Thesis is in Austria, because at that time in Germany, the Jesuit order was forbidden. So there was no other place to go. Heidegger stayed there for 2 weeks, and then he left the Jesuits. The reason is probably, in my opinion, that after 2 weeks, the novices were supposed to spend solitary time and to reflect upon their calling to become a priest. So I think that Heidegger, during those days of self-reflection, came to the conclusion that he was not cut out to become a priest. And in some ways, he already then decided that he was going to become a philosopher. But since he was still dependent on the finance of the Catholic Church, he became a student of theology at the University of Freiburg. And that lasted from 1909 till 1911. In 1911, in the summer, he decided to give up theology, and with that also the chance of becoming a priest. That for his parents was something, was a big blow. Basically, people at that time still believed if you had a son who became a priest, that more or less the eternal salvation of the whole family was guaranteed. So when he decided not to become a priest, it hurt his parents pretty badly. There's something in the chat. Okay. So in 1911, he had to change the faculty. So he was no longer in the Department of Theology, but he signed up in the Faculty of Mathematics and Natural Science. That faculty had just been created. He didn't join the Department of Philosophy. And the reason for this is that as a student of mathematics and natural science, he had absolute freedom in choosing the lecture courses and seminars he wanted to visit. So if he would have taken philosophy, there would have been a curriculum. So he couldn't just study what he would like. And during these 2 years, Heidegger studied mostly mathematics, physics, studied Einstein's theory of relativity, also took a lecture course in zoology. So he had a pretty deep understanding of natural science and mathematics, which people often forget. They don't realize that Heidegger, when he talks about science and physics, he knows what he's talking about. You can see that, for example, much later when he got to know Heisenberg, who was a physicist and a Nobel Prize winner, and Heidegger and him became friends in the early 1930s, and they would have a lot of discussions about the foundation of physics and talk about the let's say the most important concepts like time, space, etc. And Heidegger could say things that even Heisenberg could learn something from. In 1913, he finished his philosophy studies and passed his final exam, and he wrote a dissertation with the title The Doctrine of Judgment in Psychologism. So you can also see that Heidegger developed a strong interest in logic from the beginning. 2 years later, he I need to move a bit. He wrote his qualifying dissertation, Duns Scotus Theory of Categories and Meaning. And then from 1915 until 1917, he became a private teacher. In Germany, especially in those days, if you wanted to become a teacher at university, just doing a dissertation wasn't enough. You had to write a second qualifying dissertation that would give you the right to teach at the university. That's and that made you a so-called Privatlehrer or private teacher. You had to keep teaching at the university that you got your qualifying teaching license from. You had to do a seminar or a lecture course every semester. So it also means that you couldn't leave basically the university that you did your accreditation. So Heidegger gave his first lecture courses from 1915 on until 1917. During winter semester 1915-16, there was a young female student in his lecture course and seminar called Friede Petri, and Heidegger and she fell in love and would marry in 1916. And she would be his wife for the rest of his life. She's in herself is also an interesting character. Her father was a colonel in the Saxon army. She spent a year when she was 18 years old with her parents in England. She studied national economy, which was a subject matter that few girls would choose. And she's almost, she belongs still to the first generation of female students. It was for a long time forbidden for girls to go to university. Someone like Edmund Husserl, Heidegger's mentor, would say, did not allow any women to do a habilitation under his supervision because he thought dissertation, that's about as far as it can go for a woman. From 1917, 1918, he couldn't teach anymore because he was taken up too much with his military service obligations. At the end of the war, And he spent the last few months at the battlefields in France. He was a meteorologist. Basically, was chosen for that because he had this deep knowledge of mathematics and physics. As you may know, they use a lot of poisonous gas to attack the enemy. And of course, it's important that you know which way the wind will blow if you're going to use poisonous gas, that you don't poison your own soldiers. Oh, sorry. We go back. And then we get Heidegger got back in 1919. It's also the year that his first son was born. And he became he was still a private teacher, and he became the assistant of Husserl. And the assistant before Heidegger of Husserl was Edith Stein, and she had the same problem with Husserl as the other young women around Husserl, that he wouldn't allow her to do a habilitation. In 1923, he became professor in Marburg and stayed there until 1928. It's the time during which he wrote Being and Time, of course. In 1927, Being and Time was published, and that made Heidegger a very famous philosopher, not only in Germany, but also quite beyond its borders. Someone like Jean-Paul Sartre studied Being and Time while he was in prison in France in 1944 by the Germans. Then in 1928, Heidegger became the successor of Husserl in Freiburg, and he stayed professor of philosophy until 1945, the end of the Second World War. In between, he became rector of the university in 1933, and he resigned as a rector in 1934. He was basically for 1 year, he was the rector. We can talk about that later more. And the reasons probably why Heidegger was also willing to do it. From 1947 till 1949, he had the interdiction to teach and publish. That's the reason, for example, why the letter on humanism was published in Switzerland in 1947. Couldn't publish it in Germany. Since the interdiction was lifted in 1949, Heidegger could give his first public lectures in Germany, and he did that in the city of Bremen. These 4 lectures have become famous because he later gave revised versions of them also in other places. One of the lectures is, for example, the thing, das Ding. In 1951, he was retired, became an emeritus. In 1957, he became a member of the Berlin Academy of Art and a member of the Heidelberger Academy of Science. 1969, also a member of the Bavarian Academy of the Beautiful Arts. In 1973, he gave his final seminar in Zeringen, in his house. He died on May 26 in Freiburg and was buried 2 days later at the cemetery in Messkirch in his hometown. So there's a very rough overview of Heidegger's life. Any questions or points you would like me to say more about?
Yeah, thank you, Alfred. I might have a question. I'm going to come into the frame again. A very general, broad question. I feel like we know you're the expert for the biographical about Heidegger. But with Heidegger, in Heidegger's text, there's this one famous phrase from his Aristotle lecture, where he wants to talk about Aristotle's the philosophy, and he doesn't want to talk about the life of Aristotle. But then, if you just read his lectures on Nietzsche, or when he writes about Heidegger, he's himself also always talking about the life the life of Nietzsche, the life of Hölderlin. He even says it's important, if you look at Hölderlin's poems, for example, to also create what we know about Hölderlin's life, about his personal letters. So what is this relationship between the biographical and the philosophical work, especially in the case of Heidegger? Maybe you can also say something about the letters that Heidegger wrote. You know, you're also the expert for the correspondence of Heidegger. So maybe you can also say something about the importance of Heidegger's letters. Yeah, thank you.
Well, let me see. I think in the famous lecture course on Aristotle, he says Aristotle was born, did his job, and died. So, in principle, it seems that there is no interest at all in the life of the philosopher. But if you say he was born, then you already have a date, and he's born at a certain period in history. That tells you already something about his life, basically. And his work, if you want to understand his work, you also have to understand the context in which he wrote his work. If you want to understand Aristotle, for example, you need to know something about his relation to Plato and his philosophy. And of course, everybody dies, so also a philosopher will die. I think in Heidegger's case, he doesn't want to get into a kind of explaining the philosophy from the life. That's what he's against. But on the other hand, he himself starts philosophizing from his own life experience. That's what you can talk about. Maybe an example is this famous distinction between the animal and Dasein. For Heidegger, we have an immediate experience of what it means to be human. We have no immediate experience what it means to be an animal of whatever kind, a horse, a gorilla, a spider. So for Heidegger, your first task would be to understand your own being as a human being. And once you have understood that, and that's easier to understand than the being of a spider of which you have no immediate experience. And then you could try from an understanding of what it means to be human to look for the difference and similarities compared to the animals. He does it to a certain extent in a 1929-1930 lecture course on the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, where he has a long section where he talks about the being of an animal. And there he comes to the conclusion that Dasein is being in the world and has a world, and an animal is poor in world. So it's always limited and it cannot broaden this world. We have this capacity of world forming. So we're not stuck in the world because the world is always an interpretation at the same time. And we can change the interpretation of the world. It comes, for example, also to light in his interview with Richard Wieser, which he gave for his 80th birthday in Germany and was broadcasted on television. And there he quotes Marx. It says, until now, the philosophers have only thought the world differently. Now it's about changing the world. And then Heidegger says, if you understand the world differently, you have already changed the world. And I think it, even in Heidegger's own, I think if you want to have a true understanding of Heidegger's philosophy, you need to understand something about his life, especially in 1933-34, when he was director of the university during the time that the Nazis took power in Germany. And so I think it's also he also always talks about his theological origin, provenance. He talks about, for example, in this conversation with a Japanese professor on the way to language. There he also says that your provenance always remains your future. It's always coming back to you from the future in a reinterpreted way. So I think you can see it in Heidegger's questioning and then how his path of thinking unfolds, that he was determined by basically what was going on in philosophy at the time, and developed his own understanding of philosophy, originally philosophy as a science or primordial science, Urwissenschaft, then as phenomenology, and later he will let go of the name philosophy for his own thinking, which is an attempt to develop a non-metaphysical kind of thinking. And we'll get to that in a bit. The letters are important because they give you insight into his more personal life. Interestingly enough, as people know nowadays, he had many lady friends, to put it politely, and they were almost always intelligent women. Most of them were also older, had children, were married. Heidegger would talk about them, both about philosophy and his own life. So you find there texts that are not to be found anywhere else, and he tries to explain to them what he's doing in his philosophy and how their relationship helps him to further his thinking. At the same time, he's more honest in these letters than he would be in letters written to his colleagues like Karl Jaspers or Husserl or Ricoeur, because he knows it's not going to come back immediately. There was always a lot of contact going on because students would go from one professor to the other, and then they could say, well, listen, Professor Jaspers, Heidegger told in his lecture course that you misunderstood Nietzsche completely. Things like that. So
yeah, thank you, Alfred. That was very clear. Just a note also to the listeners online. The format of this lecture is that we have 2 hours to ask Alfred, Dr. Denker, questions about any parts, basically about Heidegger studies, Heidegger-related things, questions about Dr. Denker's own work. So if you have a question, please just raise the digital hand. You can also just write in the chat box, and I will read your question. Yeah, but first of all, I want to ask the students here in the room: are there any questions about this biographical part of Heidegger's life? Anything you're interested in? You want to learn more about certain parts? I think then I get it started by asking about this relationship. You mentioned that, Alfred, this friendship, this collegial friendship between Heidegger and these famous scientists. Heisenberg, I think also Niels Bohr, or at least they were meeting sometimes at conferences. Can you say a few things about that relationship? I know that there was some kind of appreciation on both sides. Heidegger took them seriously, but they also took Heidegger seriously. I would be interested.
The relation between Heidegger and these important scientists, I think you can understand it from what Heidegger says about physics. The essence of physics is nothing physical. So you cannot understand what physics is doing physics. And if you want to understand what physics is, you have to start philosophizing. So scientists like Heisenberg, who were interested in the essence of physics, started to philosophize about it, about the fundamental categories, like I said before, time, space, etc. And Heidegger was also always interested in these foundational questions of the science for at least up to around the early 1930s. He was convinced that philosophy could ground the regional ontologies of the different sciences, and that opened up the space for his discussion with people like Heisenberg. There's an anecdote that Heidegger and Heisenberg and von Weizsäcker, who was also a famous natural scientist in Germany at the time, met also at some of these conferences that were organized by the Bavarian Academy of the Beautiful Arts. And Heidegger and the Secretary General of the Academy, Graf Bodenwils, were friends, became friends, and they would prepare for these conferences. So they would have discussions first together about what would be the topic and what people they would invite to give a lecture. And then later they would meet with a bigger group where 3, 4, 5 of the lecturers would meet together, and they could talk about the topic they wanted to talk about and listen to what the others were talking about, so they could really adjust their talks as well. And it took about 2-3 years of preparation. And Heisenberg and Heidegger met several times during this kind of meetings, and they both presented at the same conferences a couple of times. And at one, von Weizsäcker was also there, and Heidegger, von Weizsäcker, and Heisenberg were having a conversation in a restaurant or a hotel. And Heisenberg and von Weizsäcker were discussing very lively, and Heidegger was just listening. At some point, they lost track of what they were talking about. And then Heidegger stepped in and he said, "Well, Professor Heisenberg, I think you said blah, 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 blah. And Professor von Weizsäcker, you said blah, blah, blah." And then they both said, "That's exactly what I was trying to say." So, and von Weizsäcker invited Heidegger also to give a seminar for his students at the University of Hamburg. So you can see there a close relation. And of course, for Heidegger, one of the big questions becomes the relation between science and technology. Now, modern science is not thinkable without modern technology, and modern technology is not thinkable without modern science, as we see it much more clearly today than Heidegger could see it, although he saw the essence of it already.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, Alfred. Very clear. If there are no more questions about this topic, I want to guide the discussion, the conversation, a little bit to Heidegger's writing and the way Heidegger's writings, his work was published. So in China, or maybe even in Europe, it's not very clear what does it mean that Heidegger's Gesamtausgabe, his collected editions, is a Ausgabe letzter Hand. Could you say something about what that implies, what that means? Do you think Heidegger changed a lot? What was his work? And maybe you can just very broadly tell the story. Why did Heidegger, do you know why Heidegger chose the Klostermann Verlag? Why not Niemeyer? What was this discussion to publish certain manuscript, others not? Maybe just very general about this. What are, for you, like the important parts about this, really from your perspective?
Okay. Well, I think let's start with something more general. I think it's important to realize that Heidegger is always working on several different investigations at the same time. And it's a bit like Aristotle. Aristotle was also someone who would be interested in a certain thing and then study it and write a paper about it. Aristotle is not a systematic thinker in that sense. Neither is Heidegger. They're not interested in fixing everything together to build a nice rounded system where you have the complete explanation of the world and the place of man within the world. So At some points in his life, especially with the publication of Being and Time, Heidegger was forced by external circumstances to publish a book. If he wanted to become the ordinarius, the full professor, after Nikolai Hartmann left Marburg for Cologne to become a professor there and also get reunited with his friend Max Scheler, the faculty wanted Heidegger to become the next chair of philosophy there. And the Berlin government said, well, it's all nice, but Heidegger didn't publish anything for 10 years, so we need some kind of proof that he is mature enough and interesting enough to be awarded such an important chair of philosophy. And Heidegger then wrote Being in Time, basically between March 1926, when he, after the winter semester, went to Totenaberg to his famous cabin. And he wrote the first 175 pages of Being in Time. And he finished basically in around October. So it's Being in Time was written in about 6 months. Which explains some of the problems in Being in Time. But anyway, when he was writing Being in Time, he used the investigations and the research he had done and took these different elements and put them together in one framework to make it into a more or less traditional philosophical treatise, because he knew if it was sent to the Berlin ministry and the minister would get his book, that he would send it to the famous philosophers of his time, people like Georg Mies, Riekert, maybe even Husserl. And he had this audience in mind as well when he was writing Being in Time. Much later, when he wrote the Contributions to Philosophy from between 1936 and 1938, he was also trying to give a kind of, to understand himself, where he had how he had developed his thinking from Being in Time until 1936, and then in the Contributions to Philosophy is also an attempt to unify some of his different paths of thinking into a whole. The advantage is if you formulate it in such a way that you have a clear understanding where you stand. So that's one part of it. Another thing is that Heidegger is very careful. He is not interested in publishing, and basically there was no obligation to publish that like we have today, where you have a position at a university, you would need to write a book every 4 years, for example, and publish 4 papers every year in peer-reviewed journal, give that much some lectures at conferences, blah blah blah. For Heidegger, it didn't exist, and you can see that most of he often starts by giving a lecture or a presentation, and he will work on the text after he's given it, and often repeat it in this new form 2, 3, 4 times, and keep adding and correcting it and trying to make it better than it was. And then when he chooses the papers and the lectures that he wants to publish, like in these volumes, pass marks, off the beaten track, and on the way to language, he still goes back to the text, reads it again, rethinks it, makes changes, and also thinks very carefully about the constitution of the book. For example, in Vorträge und Aufsätze, essays and lectures, which was never published in English in its original form. They took parts of it and published it independently of each other. It has 3 parts. That's for Heidegger, it's important that it has these 3 parts, and there's a continuation of the questioning that goes on in the book. So that's the way Heidegger works, basically. When you look at his manuscripts, he always has a double paper page. So on the left, he writes the text, and on the right, he later makes corrections, additions, etc. So You can also see when he's writing to give a lecture, he's underlining in the text with different colors. So he knows when he's giving the lecture, this is very important. This should be ironic, for example. And that's something you lose in the published version. You can't see it. So in January 1970, Heidegger had a stroke, a bad stroke. He was bedridden for half a year, and he could not move very much for almost a year. And he lost his speech for a while. And his writing changes after the stroke. It's different than before the stroke. And basically, he didn't leave his house anymore. He couldn't go to Greece, Italy, France, that he visited several times before then. And one of his publishers was Günter Neske, who published the Nietzsche volumes, for example. He got the idea of doing a collected edition of the work of Heidegger. And his idea was that it would be a project of the three main publishing houses that published Heidegger's writings, Niemeyer, Kloosterman, and then his own publishing house, Neske. And he wanted to organize in such a way that there would be a committee for the edition with people like Gadamer or Otto Puckel, for example, who were both involved in the critical edition of Hegel. And he also wanted the Land Baden-Württemberg to finance it and to pay for two positions for people who would decipher Heidegger's handwriting and make it into typescripts. His brother started doing that in 1938, and he made quite a few of them. And later, after he was too old to do it anymore, he had some of his lady friends who would take over. But there's still a lot that's never been transcribed, so you can only read it in the handwriting. So Neske proposed this plan, and Heidegger originally was against it. He wrote Neske, for example, a letter in 1972, 73, that he would stop publishing in Germany because nobody really understood what he was trying to do and how he was developing a new kind of thinking. But still then, Kloosterman, who was the businessman of the three, you could say, got together with Elfriede, his wife, and his son Herman. And they decided, basically, they were going to do the complete edition and made Heidegger agree to it in 1973. And then, of course, it became a solo project of Kloosterman. He kept the two other publishing houses out of it. That's the reason why you can't buy some of the volumes of the Gesamtausgabe individually. So you cannot buy the Gesamtausgabe edition of Being and Time. You have to buy the original Niemeyer. And the same goes for the books that were published by Neske. And Heidegger started to think about the concept of this edition. And there were two people involved in that. One was Friedrich Wilhelm von Hermann, who was at that time also his secretary. And the other person that most people never realized is Walter Biemel. And Walter Biemel had experience in editing because he worked for several years at the Husserl archive and published writings by Husserl. And also von Hermann got it somehow got Biemel out of the picture. And then it became basically a project controlled and guided by Hermann Heidegger, von Hermann, and Elfriede. Yeah, Martin Heidegger himself made more or less the conception of the first and the second division. The Gesamtausgabe has 4 divisions. The first division is the published writings. The second division are the lecture courses. If you look at the original plan, there was no mention of the Freiburg lecture courses he gave between 1919 and 1923. So you would go, and you can see it still in the numbering. You go from the published writings, final volume, volume 16, you go to volume 70, which is the first course he gave in Marburg, Marburg. And he gave some indications for the third division. In the third division, you get these manuscripts like contributions to philosophy. And there's hardly anything for the fourth division. That was put together basically by Hermann Heidegger and von Hermann. Originally, when they started publishing the first volumes of the Gesamtausgabe, the people who were editing were chosen by Heidegger. And this idea of the edition of the last end was an attempt, sorry, sip of water, maybe it helps. Was an attempt to avoid that somebody would have the final say about how it was going to be published. So every editor was responsible for his own volume and should publish it according to how he or she thought it should be published. They ran quickly into problems because for example, the edition of the History of the Concept of Time has more than 230 mistakes in it. And that's when Hermann Heidegger stepped in and told his mother, "You have done enough. I'm now going to take charge of this because we cannot have these that many mistakes in our publication." And that meant there was 3 people were basically running the Gesamtausgabe: Hermann Heidegger, von Hermann, and a guy called Tietjen, who was there doing the dirty work of transcribing manuscripts. And they would control if an editor would say, "Well, I finished my volume," they would control it and also help out in some ways during the process of editing. And then you get to several interesting questions. I think the volume 16 is an example of not obeying your own principles of edition. It's published in the first division, which means published writings, but most of it is unpublished. Hermann Heidegger decided to put all the material around his rectorship in it. It should have been a volume with some of the texts that are in it, like Alassanite. It should have been maybe a 200-page volume. And then they made a mistake. Heidegger wrote an introduction gave a lecture course, Introduction to Academic Studies, in summer semester 29, if I'm not mistaken, at the top of my head, where they said there's no manuscript, so it probably never gave the lecture course. But then in Japan, a student came up with his notes that were taken during the lecture course. And that's why they have this jump from in volume 2930, which is a 2-volume, which is 2 numbers for one book, basically. Because originally the 29 lecture course would have been 29 and the fundamental concepts would have been 30. And then you get to the more interesting and big question of the black notebooks. Now, the black notebooks, Heidegger started using a new kind of working and also developing his thinking in these notebooks. He himself calls them always notebooks. They added they made it the black notebooks because it sounds more mysterious. Black always has this aura of negativity, black money, black magic, etc. I personally think that Heidegger never intended them to be included in the Gesamtausgabe. One way of seeing it is, in the original plan, there were 70 volumes. If you add to the 70 volumes the Freiburg lecture courses, then you're more or less there with the in the original plan there was no room for 10 volumes of notebooks. And of course, they decided to bring them. And originally, it was decided, according to Hermann Heidegger, that it should be at the end of the Gesamtausgabe, but they moved it forward. Basically, it's financial reasons. Kloosterman's publishing house was going through rough times. The editor, Peter Trafny, who they gave a contract to do all the volumes, was also interesting in making some money, or interested in making some money. And that's the reason why they decided to publish 3 volumes at the same time. And publish at the same time in the same publishing house this book by Trafny on Heidegger and the Jewish conspiracy. And of course, if you do it that way, the reception of the volumes will be determined basically what Trafny is saying. And there's enough things you can criticize and question in Trafny's presentation. So, and also Trafny himself they made an excerpt of these 2.5 pages of anti-Semitic quotes by Heidegger, some of which, if you read it in the context, sound very differently than when you just pick out one sentence. And they sent it to Henri Lenoir, who had written in France the chapter on Heidegger and anti-Semitism in a big dictionary edited by François Vidier. He said there that there is no anti-Semitic remark of Heidegger's in his Gesamtausgabe. So he was shocked when he got it, ran to Vidier, and that's how the whole ball started rolling. You find them only in the third volume. In the first 2 volumes, there's no mention of anti-Semitism, or remarks that you can interpret as anti-Semitic. So if they would have published the first volume on its own, it would have received a very different reception than when it was already all cast in this light of Heidegger's. Basically, then you got the philosophical journal putting up a questionnaire, and should we end with Heidegger? And then people could vote yes or no. That kind of nonsense happened. And it was basically carried out in the newspapers. I think they are far more interesting in a philosophical sense, especially his later notebooks, where he's developing new ideas and new ways of thinking that you do not find elsewhere. So they deserve much more careful study than just throwing them in the bin because of these anti-Semitic remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Alfred. I want to ask, we can stick with this topic of the black notebooks. I think that is very interesting. There's one question. Could you say a few things about maybe the impact, just from your own experience, the impact, I think, was 2014, 2015, maybe, when the first 3 black notebooks were published. And then a lot of newspapers, they were very quick in responding to that. They already, this was very quick and it was very clear, like the narrative was already there. Maybe also because Peter Trafny's book was published with it. But maybe you can say something. Did it change kind of the landscape of Heidegger studies? What was the impact? Was it a negative impact? Positive impact? Yeah. Just a few things.
The impact was completely negative. Basically, they shot themselves in the foot. It's I experienced in very many ways. In Germany, there's hardly any work on Heidegger being done anymore. If you are a student and you have an interest in Heidegger and you want to write your dissertation about Heidegger, an honest professor would say you better not do it if you aspire to an academic career. So it's the same with funding. If you try to find some extra money, for example, for the Heidegger archive in Messkirch, and you go to business people and say, would you have some money available? Well, everybody says no, thank you, because I don't want to get my name involved in this whole discussion. I rather support the football team or the local Blaskapelle than Heidegger. And it's also in the grants of money from the big institutions in Germany. It's very difficult to get any money for Heidegger. It's the same with the DAAD, the German the service that takes care of the exchange of students. If foreign students want to come to Germany and then work on Heidegger, it's much more difficult to get funding than it was before the publication. And it was really, in many ways, was idiotic. They organized a conference in Freiburg, and several of the people who were speaking at the conference, when they were asked about, did you ever read the Black Notebooks? They publicly said no. Yeah. But I've read the book of Trafny, and Trafny is a renowned Heidegger scholar, so what he says must be true.
Yeah.
And based on that kind of nonsense. And the impact in other countries has been less, also because the publication goes more slowly with the translation. So, and it's not heard, let's say, studies of Heidegger in South America or in other countries in Europe, like Spain, than it has in Germany. And the bad thing that it happened in Germany is that, as we all know, the work of important philosophers, poets, writers, novelists needs to be redone every 50 to 100 years, because our whole way of reading text and interpreting them changes. So it's almost always the case when you finish such an edition, you can basically start on the next one if you already finish it. And I think for Heidegger, it would be necessary now to do a critical edition. Give one example. Some of the volumes of the Gesamtausgabe with lecture courses, there is only a marginal amount of material written by Heidegger himself. It can be just some of the keywords and short sentences and the structure of what he was going to say, but he would develop the lecture course freely when he was speaking to the students. Of course, there are transcripts by the students of almost all, basically all Heidegger's lectures and presentations over the years. And the editor of the volume would use the student notes to write a complete text. So if you read, for example, the text of Heidegger's lecture course on the sophist, it seems like it's a written out text. But if you look at the material, there's about 80 pages of manuscript by Heidegger that has been put together with the students' notes by the editor. So you don't know what is Heidegger and what is not Heidegger. So it would have been much more sensible, in my opinion, to say, well, this in the Gesamtausgabe we publish the manuscripts, and you can do a separate edition of the notes by the students. And then there's, of course, now there's still the question of when the Gesamtausgabe is finished, there's still quite a bit of material left in Marbach. It's about thousands of notes by Heidegger that are kept in boxes And that would be something where they make the same mistake again. So the son of Hermann Heidegger is now the executor of the literary estate and is in charge of Heidegger's publishing. Visited Marbach, in this case, where the old estate is, with Peter Trafny of all people, and then Klaus Held, who was at that time already 84 years old. And they went through these notes and some of folders with material. Trafny told me that there's a folder on Karl Marx in it, of which Heidegger already decided it's not going to be published in the planned 2 or 3 extra volumes as an appendix to the Gesamtausgabe. But they will choose what is published. And then there will still be thousands of notes not published, so you get the same problematic that people will say, well, they left out the really bad stuff. It's still in the archive and nobody has access to it. Instead of saying, let's do something different, something more interesting, and make it available on the internet. It saves you, you need to scan all the material anyway, if you want to keep it safe for a long time. So then put it on the internet, get somebody, pay somebody to do a transcription of most of these notes and put these transcriptions next to it, so people can read what's being said in a note, and then you can start playing with it. You can look for the based on the handwriting, you can date it more or less, and you can also try to find pieces that belong together, and things like that. And it would open up a new kind of Heidegger studies.
Is that what you would suggest? Do you think that would be the best case for the future of Heidegger studies? It's kind of a critical, digitalized edition of Heidegger's manuscript?
Yeah, you could do it. You could do it also with these student transcripts. If you make a complete, sometimes there are 5 or 6 different ones. So if you all publish them on the internet, then at the end you can still decide we'll do a published version of it of 200-300 copies, which will be very expensive, but are meant for libraries, basically. So you keep it also as a book, which is still the best way to preserve things. Technology, especially this kind of technology, develops very quickly. If you still remember the old floppy disk that you would stick into your computer, if you have your stuff on floppy disk, you have some research centers at universities that still try to keep these old machines working, so you can re-digitalize it. But that's, I think, much more interesting and would open up new ways of working with the text and also make new material available. The same goes for complete correspondence. There's still thousands of letters which are interesting, or some of them really important, that are still not published and probably will never be published.
More questions? For example, for the first division, for the published Gastabteilung, if someone would look at the manuscripts, would it be possible to see what is like I mean, there's not an original that hasn't been changed, but would it be possible to see what Heidegger changed 10 years later, 20 years later? Is it possible to see that from the manuscript? Is there a way?
It's difficult, but you can. You also have it in the published versions. Heidegger always had a copy of the published version that he would use for himself. And there he would also make annotations and corrections that might be incorporated in the second edition. So you can track it down a little to a certain extent. One of there is the corrections that Heidegger made to being in time are no longer there when they were publishing it and proofreading. But that's also an example. I think it's rather ridiculous. There's no critical edition of Being and Time.
Yeah.
We have at least 7 different editions during Heidegger's lifetime. Of course, in the beginning, it still has part 1. In the 3rd edition from 1941, if I'm not mistaken, the dedication to Husserl is removed from it, which comes back in the 4th edition after the war. Then you have editions where it says this is the 6th edition, but it's unchanged reprint of the 5th. But if you compare them carefully, the 5th and the 6th, you can still find changes. And it also means that if a student has, let's say, the 6th edition and his professor has the 5th edition, that the student may quote from the 6th edition something which is not in the 5th edition, and then the professor would say, well, it's not in the text. And if you...
That we have a philosophy that doesn't have a critical edition.
Yeah, you should start. You could do a scan of the original manuscript that was used by the typesetter. Because in those days it was letter by letter and in these big boxes, so it was an enormous amount of work, and you could do it that way, and then you can say, well, this is we have a look again at the manuscript and compare it to the 1st edition, and that's the standard text, 1st edition. And then you can make visible all the changes in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. And
yeah.
And the other thing is the Heidegger's notes. In the Gesamtausgabe, they have the notes from the so-called cabin copy, which is of the 2nd edition. But there's also there are more. And there's one of the 1st edition that Heidegger also used, and that has many, many more annotations than the one that was published. So that would be interesting as well to do that. You can also do it as a digital thing, and then transcribe the remarks that he makes. And you can clearly see what he's doing.
Yeah. I want to ask, who makes that decision? Like, who in the end makes the decision not to have or to have a critical edition? Is it not?
That's, the final decision lies now with Ulf Heidegger, with the grandson of Heidegger. And the other question is how, if you could get it financed. And I think if they would have used the whole scandal of publication of the Black Notebooks in the right way, they could have set up a big research project.
Yeah.
Get funding for it. And that's the same with the correspondence. We try to get it funded by the Academy of Sciences and Minds. But they withdrew basically also after publication of the Black Notebooks. I think whatever you may think of Heidegger, if you think he's a Nazi and you shouldn't read his works, you still have the problem that you cannot understand the history of 20th century philosophy without Heidegger in it. Because his influence is so massive, not only in Germany, but especially in France, with all the famous French philosophers of the 20th century have something to do with Heidegger.
Yeah.
So it's still, it should still be part of academic studies, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, I can at least say for China and for Chinese research, Heidegger is very popular in China. People doing very rigorous critical research on Heidegger here, even on the Black Notebook. This part that was that led to a scandal in Germany and France. Here in China, people didn't care that much about those parts. They cared about the philosophical content of them. So we are very great researchers here doing Heidegger. So maybe not in Germany, not so much anymore in Germany, but yeah, in Asia, in Japan, in China, very active, very strong. Yeah. I want to ask the people around me and maybe in the online room if there are any questions, any topic you would like to talk about with Dr. Denker, anything else you want to know or ask about. We can really make detours or change the topic a little bit, Dr. Denker. Just conversation be open.
I have a question that I would like to discuss with Professor Denker, and sorry, can you count my voice?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just speak up a little bit.
Okay. In the position.
Yeah, it's louder, but I think it's okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm changing the position to make like my voice clearly. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Denker, for your speech. And I'm a PhD year one student, and I would like to. I attempt to explore maybe how could Heidegger's philosophy have a dialogue or interrelationship with social science. We know that in social science, the human beings is in some sense modelized or maybe make as a function to calculate in the social science. So we make lots of calculation and quantify them and to make maybe public policies. And I know that in Heidegger's contribution to philosophy, like his very last book on event, there's a section, like the second section, he talks about science or technology, about making or das Machen. It, in some sense, like how we understand being, or a special way of grasp beings. But in social science, we find that that we, in some sense, maybe making ourselves or have a such a way das Machen to ourselves. How could Heidegger speak about that? Or that's what I'm interested in.
Well, Heidegger would begin by making a distinction between science and philosophy.
Yeah.
So it depends on which Heidegger you want to develop it from. You could say in Being and Time. Heidegger is asking the question of being again. And that's why it starts with this quote from the Sophist. And his question is not what is being in Being and Time, but what is the sense of being. And the basic idea is that the sense of being is disclosed in human Dasein. And if you want to understand what human Dasein is, human being, you have to find a new approach, which he calls and took over from Husserl, phenomenology. So if you do a phenomenology of Dasein, which is called an existential analysis in Being and Time, you can see that the being of the human being is different from the being of all other beings. And the main difference is that we care about our being. We are aware of our being, and we're also aware of our finitude or mortality. So science is always objectifying beings. That becomes an object, related, disclosed by a subject. It's always based on the subject-object relation. Heidegger wants to get before this distinction between subject and object, and you can give different names to it, mind and body. For example, consciousness and external world. All these double meaning, or these connections between consciousness and the external world, are unsolvable if consciousness you cannot reach outside of consciousness. That's the position of the neo-Kantians. You can only know something which is given in consciousness. And other people try still to think of the human being as the thinking substance in the sense of Descartes, and then nature as an extended substance. We get the same problem if you have two different substances. How can there be any interaction between them? So Heidegger says you have to ask a deeper question. That's why he's trying to do fundamental ontology, to get beneath this distinction. So in human Dasein, and that's the question that's been forgotten in metaphysics, according to Heidegger, there is this moment of care, this being involved, which you can never disclose from an objective perspective. If you reduce the human being to an object, you lose this moment of caring. So that's what Heidegger is basically developing in Being and Time, is on the one hand to disclose the structure of care through an analysis of all these existentialities that he mentions, being in the world, being in, etc. And at the same time, if you can disclose all the ways in which human beings can understand being, then you could make a final interpretation of the senses of being and thus come to an understanding of being. That was the idea of Being and Time. Of course, Heidegger ran into trouble when he was developing it further. That's why he only published the first two divisions of Being and Time and never the third division of the first part, and the whole second part is also missing. If you jump then to Heidegger's later thinking, once he has understood that the history of metaphysics is the history of nihilism, that it starts in early Greek thinking with questioning being, or being aware of being, and it ends with nothing. Being comes to nothing. It finds its final expression in the metaphysics of Nietzsche, where will to power and eternal return are the essence and existence of being. So what is really being is the will to power, and the will to power is in such a way that it always wants more power, and since it's metaphysical thinking, being must be understood as unchangeable. And that's why Nietzsche then comes to the conclusion that there must be an eternal recurrence of the same. And you have a kind of Nullstands. There can be nothing else than this will to power that's always building more power and is bringing itself back again and again and again. And that's a horrible way of thinking about your life, if you think that everything that happens in your life will be happening an infinite number of times again. So to get away from metaphysics and nihilism, Heidegger first tries to overcome nihilism. Thinks, well, he might be a way to overcome it. The first attempt is basically to give a new foundation to metaphysics, which he tries to do in Being and Time, but doesn't work out. So then he starts talking about Verwindung, which is more like a healing process. Maybe you can heal from nihilism. And that doesn't work out as well, because you're still attached to nihilism. So in his later thinking, he develops this notion of Gelassenheit. Now, Gelassenheit in German, it's translated either as releasement or serenity in English. But Gelassenheit is the German prefix ge, and then Lassenheit. So it's the collecting, the gathering of all ways of lassen, of letting. So it's letting be free. You can't express all the meanings of lassen in German in English with letting. So you have zulassen, which is more allowing. You have vorlassen, nachlassen, etc. And in this, I would like to call it that the fundamental disposition of human being is that we have this capability to let things, allow them to show themselves. It's a phenomenological element in it. And in that way, you can also let metaphysics be. You don't fight against it, you just let it be. And you still need to get involved with metaphysics and understand the history of metaphysics so you can see the limits of metaphysics. And from the limits of metaphysics, you can see the possibility of another kind of thinking. Now, then, there are two different ways you can develop that. Heidegger is also becomes aware more and more that technology and calculative thinking are connected. So we see the development of technology, and Heidegger says, well, the essence of technology is both enframing and standing reserve. So it's what you mean by making. So we think everything is makeable, everything is there for us to consume, to use in any way we like. Mm-hmm. And it's being ready for use. And I don't know if you have Amazon in China, but so an Amazon warehouse is a very clear example of it, where you have infinite amount of different stuff where you can just order on the internet, and within 3 hours they deliver whatever you want to have to your doorstep. So that's this notion of standing reserve. It's ready, it only needs to be delivered as quickly as possible. And we're even trying to make ourselves. We become more, and in that sense, objectify ourselves. We become objects to ourselves. If we become objects to ourselves, we basically lose what is our essence, and that's our possibility to think. Then if we lose that, for Heidegger, that's the biggest danger in our time. So he tries to think of another kind of thinking, which is not calculative. And he has different names for it over the years. He calls it being historical thinking. He calls it Besinnung. It's a kind of meditative thinking. He calls it Andenken, remembrance. He calls it Bedenken, Erdenken. And in the final years of his life, it becomes a poetizing thinking. And also a thinking, a thinking that in its thinking is thinking for that, thinking that which it can think, it discloses itself to us. So you can, well, Heidegger, he's not against science. He says, well, science is a very interesting and important way of disclosing the being of beings. But we should not reduce all disclosing of the being of beings to the scientific approach, this calculative approach. You can give an example. If you have a work of art like a painting by Van Gogh, you can, of course, measure the size of the frame. And then you have some knowledge about the work of art. You can study the paint that was used and see which company made the linen that he used, etc., things like that. But that doesn't disclose the work of art as a work of art. You cannot disclose it that way. You can get some interesting information, and we live in an age of information. So if you go on the internet, there's an infinite amount of information about anything you can think of, basically. But that doesn't mean it's not knowing. It's knowing about is different from knowing something. So I would say sociology, even if it's quantitative or calculative, can still bring out interesting bits of knowing about human being. But it can only it cannot understand the whole of human being because it's already objectifying always. I hope that helps a bit.
Yeah, that was great, Alex. Thank you. Great answer. Yeah, I also again want to encourage the participants to ask questions, but now the final moments of this lecture, I want to ask you, Alfred, what is, if students here in China want to find out more about your work, more about your writing, more about your teaching, what books should they buy? What articles should they read? How can they find you? Maybe they want to attend your courses, participate in your courses. And what are your plans with Heidegger research? How are you doing, understanding, teaching, your teaching obligations, your plans for future research?
I think, first of all, I think Heidegger's thinking is of great importance to our future, not just to our future as philosophers or future as human beings, but I think that through Heidegger's analysis also of this notion of nihilism, you can see that with this, the Western way of living life, of consumerism, of always more. We have always need to have economical growth. And we are beginning to realize nowadays, I think, that there are limits. That and you see it, I just saw it in Spain where I live, with these floods around Valencia, and if you see what the kind of damage that does and the number of people that die, it's always something that wakes you up in that sense. And I think we need to find an alternative. And I think you can develop a different kind of dwelling, of living on the planet through Heidegger's notion of Gelassenheit. So for me, it's important in these dark ages of Heidegger studies to keep Heidegger thinking alive and make it accessible to people. So at the moment, I have I've grounded this institute, European Center for Heidegger Studies. So recently, we were able to obtain an office space where we can bring in the materials that we have for a Heidegger archive. There's part of it is books, of course, Heidegger's writings, also in different translations, secondary literature about Heidegger, but also some manuscripts and unpublished things that people can work with. It's important, I think, that we teach also younger people how to read Heidegger's handwriting, because that's in the end the main thing, the main skill that you need if you want to keep Heidegger alive. So I've done a couple of webinars, for example, on how to read Heidegger's handwriting, and then we work on a manuscript and try to teach how to read it, how you can decipher how Heidegger writes. And if you practice it for long enough, then you will begin to be able to read it. And that will allow you also to check the published versions, for example, against the manuscripts. So I think on one hand, there's a need for the traditional scholarly way of working with text and disclosing the thinking of philosophers. And more importantly, if I also in my webinars, sometimes I do something more like a lecture course where I give an interpretation of Heidegger's paths of thinking from 25 to 35, for example. I also do webinars where we read the text together. And since most of it is in English, we also have a look at the German where necessary to see if the translation brings out really what's said in the German, or sometimes there are mistaken translations which make no sense. So that's something that is, I think, also interesting, and people usually find it rewarding. It's different of reading a text by your own or reading it with a group of people where you get the input of how other people read the same text as you read. So it is an enrichment of your understanding of Heidegger. I also organize conferences on Zoom, basically now 3 times a year, in January, May, and September. In May, we do we did last year, this year we did for the first time a conference on Heidegger and non-Western traditions of thinking, which include, of course, Chinese thinking. That's one of the things that Heidegger is also afraid of, that with modern technology, the European Western way of seeing life in the world is exported with it, and is basically killing off the traditional ways of thinking in many of these countries. They see it happen probably in China as well. And for Heidegger, since, let's say, the Chinese tradition of thinking is non-metaphysical, it opens up the possibility of a dialogue and for development of non-metaphysical thinking, which comes from the European way of thinking. I think there's a lot that we can then learn from each other. And it's interesting if you do a conference on that topic, that you have people from Japan, China, India, with their own different traditions, talk about them, and also how they read Heidegger, for example. And Heidegger is always very careful. It's about translating. So it's not just using different words, say, but it's bringing out the real meaning of what's being said. In the future, I hope to be able to find the ground found a place which is big enough to make it possible for people to stay for extended periods of time, either to do private research or also organize seminars and conferences that take place there, where people can then also stay, and you can share not just on Zoom. You always have a certain time. You start at 7 and you stop at 9, and that's it. If you're together, you can say after the session, okay, let's go out for a coffee, let's go out for a drink or for a meal, and then you can keep talking about these topics in a different way than you do during a conference. I think that's important as well. So that's something I will try to bring back now in Spain. Do also seminars that will also be like this one, be played on Zoom, so you can attend it digitally. But there will be people just present, which is always nicer. We'll see where that goes. Of course, the big advantage of Zoom is that you can do what we are doing now. I sit in Spain, you sit in China, and we can have a talk with each other. It's the same as my webinars. I have people who sit in New York or in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and another is in Mumbai in India. And you all meet at the same time and place, and you could never do a webinar of 2 hours for several weeks if people would have to get together. It's not possible for people to say, well, I'll come over from New York for 2 hours. It doesn't work that way. So that's one of the advantages. A colossal use of technology, I would say, doing these Zoom things. So in the long run, there should be and then you can also show something about this different kind of dwelling that I want to try and live, basically. You have your own, you produce your own vegetables, for example. So most of the more healthy, more simple, less consuming way of life, and with less ecological footprint, as they call it. So that's that's where I see my own future, and it's a long way, and it's a tough job. But I think it's important that somebody at least is trying to keep Heidegger thinking alive. To be honest, I do more Heidegger webinars every week than is being done in the whole of Germany. So that already shows you how much Heidegger disappeared from the 50s.
Okay, Alfred. Yeah, let me just thank you for today, for your talk, for your time. But let me also say that here in China and among the people, even in the dark ages of Heidegger studies, that we very much appreciate and admire your work and your efforts for Heidegger studies. And here in China, for example, we've spoken about this, but I just announced it here that we want to translate your work into Chinese, make it more accessible. I think also the technological possibilities, maybe in the coming years, are going to help with that we're going to get better quality, higher quality translations, can make this work more accessible. Yeah, but also this lecture, we will upload it, make it accessible online, and we will share the links to your groups, to your work. And we can, if they want to participate, if they want to get in touch with you, can send you an email. And yeah.
Well, I don't bite, so you can always send me an email.
Okay.
And I will reply. Well, thanks again for hosting this event, and it was a pleasure. We probably will do it again next year at some point.
Hopefully,
in a different.
Okay, thank you, Alfred. Thank you for your
Thank everybody for being there. See you.